San Diegans accomplish great things every day. We care about our neighbors and our community. We are proud of our diversity. We are resilient. We hold our leaders accountable. We live in one of the most dynamic cities in America, the San Diego Union-Tribune, telling San Diego's story for more than 150 years.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gail F. Baker, Vice President and Provost at the University of San Diego.
And I'm Dr. Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USD.
For the second year in a row, USD, along with its College of Arts and Sciences and Humanities Center, is proud to return as the presenting sponsor for the 2021 San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books.
As a university deeply committed to the liberal arts, USD promotes a form of lifelong learning that ignites curiosity, builds critical connections across different ideas and topics by seeing them from unique perspectives.
Our partnership with the Festival of Books enables all of us avid readers to come together as a community alongside renowned authors from all over the world and to dive deeply into imaginative stories and important themes.
Yes, books do have the ability to open minds and hearts. On behalf of the University of San Diego, we thank you for joining us for today's program to explore the world of books with us.
Enjoy the presentation.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Kellogg, and welcome to the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. I am privileged to be here with V.E. Schwab, who goes by Victoria in real life, and Madeline Miller, who goes by Madeline. I want to introduce their books, and then we're going to get right into a great conversation about them. So, In the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, a young woman in the 18th century France, desperate to escape the mundane life ahead of her, makes a deal with, I keep wanting to say the devil, but it's more like he's like a dark god. Victoria definitely doesn't use the word devil, and she would if she meant it. But she can be free, but she can't be remembered. And so then we have 300 years in the life of Addie LaRue, going from France, across Europe, and eventually to New York City. And in Circe, which I'm going to mispronounce, and I'm going to let Madeline get it right, Madeline Miller takes the story of a minor antagonist in the Odyssey and inverts it, putting Circe at the center of her own epic, focused on witchcraft and the power dynamics between humans and gods more so than battles. And so welcome, Victoria and Madeline. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm so excited. Where did each of you get the idea to write like an epic with a woman at its center?
Ooh, Madeline, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think, this comes from, I loved Greek myths since I was a child, but I was also frustrated by them because I often felt that the characters I wanted to know more about were never at the center of the story. They were always at the margins, particularly the women, and their stories were incredibly flat and two-dimensional. And one of the most intriguing of these characters was Circe, the witch who turns men into pigs in the Odyssey. And so what I wanted to do is to really give her the same scope that Achilles and Odysseus and all the other male heroes had been allowed for millennia, and let her make big mistakes and have big adventures and meet monsters and create magic, but all centered around her life and her story. And partially I always loved digging into the psychology of these characters. And so one of the places where I started is, why is Circe turning men into pigs, which goes completely undressed in the Odyssey.
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure she was in the right. I always just really has her reasons. It's interesting. Similarly, I love Faustian bargains. And they take a lot of forms. Like obviously, there's the traditional bargain narrative, but you see in like most immortality tales in some way. There's always that trade-off. But similarly, almost all of these Faustian bargains that we read about and that we see are about men. And it's really interesting when you deal with like male immortals, because they essentially have infinite amount of time. And so they see everything there is to see and go everywhere there is to go and eat everything there is to eat and screw everyone there is to screw. And then they get bored. And you end up with these existential ennui tales, right? And I just kept thinking about the fact that already deals with so much autonomy and agency, the presupposition that if you had immortality, you would be completely untethered from society in that way. And I just thought a female presenting body would never get to move through time and space with that much autonomy. Even if you were immortal, you're still in this body that has a huge amount of societal expectations and restrictions about it. And so that was kind of one of the main starting points for Addie, is even before you add the curse, this idea that she can't be remembered by people, which is itself a very gendered curse, because the only reason that the devil, we'll call him the devil, gives her this curse is because all of the men that he does deals with care about glory and being remembered. And so he assumes that the worst thing he can do to this woman is take away her ability to, in his opinion, leave a mark. And so it was really about how does the Faustian bargain change and how do the curses change when you add this female form to it.
And in some ways, I think that ties into what's happening in Circe, which is taking these very old ideas about gods and expectations of the tension between gods and humans and their interrelationships. Both of your books do that. And I tend not to think about gods very much in my daily life, which might be a problem, but I wonder if you, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of this culture of like, how it's this sort of crazy power relationship that in some cultures was very present. Like when Addie LaRue starts out, like the church is very present. And in Madeline, you're dealing with the mythologies of the gods and the humans in that interaction. Could you each talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Totally. Well, I'll just say that I've always been fascinated specifically in polytheistic religions because, when you have a monotheism, when you have the church or, anything of that nature, the thing is that you run into is that paradox of like an infallible God with a capital G. And I find that to be a very bland God because it can't make mistakes. It is ineffable. It is infallible. It is all of these things. But one of the things I loved about studying polytheistic systems, Greco-Roman and Norse, is that when you take the capital G away and you make it a lowercase g and you have a pantheon, all of a sudden the gods really start to much more closely resemble the people that worship them, for better and for worse. They get to have flaws. And I just really wanted to look at an iteration of an old god, something that predates the devil, but we call him the devil for ease of work here. And I wanted, instead of making him this ineffable, mysterious figure, I wanted to make him a petulant child, because that's exactly what I felt that God would be. And so my main interest in dealing with gods was in taking Luke out of this higher tier and really bringing him down to the fallibility of mortals.
Yes, I love that. And I love the way you draw that character. And for me, I'm always really interested in the psychology. And so looking at the way the ancient Greek and Roman authors represented the gods, mostly the gods were terrible. They were selfish and cruel and petty and vengeful. And if we were going to diagnose them in a modern context, we would call them sociopathic narcissists. There are a few exceptions to this. Characters like Prometheus, sometimes the lesser gods, in particular, the nymphs, can be more helpful, and they seem to care more about humanity and other people around them. But but the ancients very deliberately would use them as metaphors also for what happens when humans have so much power that they become like gods. So you can see in Virgil's Aeneid, his portraits of the gods really very deliberately reflect political figures of the day. And so it turns out that this is a real thing that happens, that psychology has shown us that when there are people who are given so much power that they are basically completely separated from the rest of humanity, they have no consequences, they have no one telling them no. Turns out that's really bad for us. And that what happens is that our empathy starts dropping. And it turns out you can, though, here's the bit of good news, you can actually fight against it. And the way you fight against it is that you remember a time that you were powerless, and that restores your empathy. And so I was really interested in that idea in terms of the gods, that they were these, narcissistic, cruel beings who have forgotten their ability to connect with other people. But what if Circe had the ability to feel? What if she did have that ability to have empathy? Partially because she is powerless for so much of the time. So I love that sort of interplay that, to me, humanity is deeply flawed, but actually much better than dealing with the gods.
Madeline, you say that, and I'm just picturing the current space race.
Yes,
exactly. People achieve a megalomaniac's level of power and start to think about themselves truly as a center of the universe, as kind of completely outside of, and I'm just looking, I'm like, and maybe you go to space.
Yeah, literally lifted above everybody.
Yes.
So each of you wrote these books that must have taken a really long time. Were there any times that you were thinking of the actual present day as, Victoria, I know that Addie LaRue comes up to almost the present day, but were you thinking about the present day as being reflected in the tensions that you were putting in there?
I mean, it's hard, right? Because I wanted to create something that was almost present day, but at the same time, like, I did choose to end it before, like, the 2016 election. I think this is the closest I've come really to temporality in my books, and that I try to make them really timeless. And so I was careful in that, like, to write a book that is so rooted in time, even though Addie as a character, she moves through time and kind of in some ways is very touched by it, in some ways untouched. I felt like my modern day still needed to be a few steps behind. I still needed to create a sense of, I knew the story that I wanted to tell, and it wasn't that story. In a lot of ways, Addie exists. She has an interesting philosophy, which is that, when you're living through history, you don't always perceive it as history. And so I wanted to be very careful that her presence still felt like it wasn't history with a capital H. I also lived in New York City in 2014 when I gave her cap. And so I kind of worked backwards from there all the way back to 1714. But yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it in terms of, for her, it really applies to technology. She can't use it because her curse, it starts at a time when there is very, much less technology, and watching it adapt with her over time was one of the things I had the most fun with. But also, you really had to start thinking of the nuts and bolts of it, of like, well, you can't have a cell phone, you can't have a computer, you can't have credit cards, you can't have any of our modern forms of identification and commerce.
Right. I mean, I feel like I'm always kind of thinking of the modern world, that to me, the ancient world and the modern world are incredibly close. And I just feel like that there is so much resonance. These stories are so incredibly timeless. I mean, the beginning of the Iliad literally starts with a pandemic and a huge fight over how leaders are handling the pandemic. I mean, it's really shocking when you look at the ancient material, how incredibly fresh it is. Technology has changed, culture has changed, but we humans have not changed. And so looking at that, I feel like I'm always thinking of the modern world, but not in sort of like a shove it in, but in just this way that, like, it's already there. It's all there.
So tell me each of you, like, an example of what were some of the challenges or things that you did to embody these women's lives, because it's over, 300 years in Addie LaRue, and Circe is a couple hundred years or maybe a couple millennia. She doesn't really count for a while. So tell me, like, it's so that you could write thousands and thousands of pages. How did you choose some of these moments to make them be like live and live in this body in this moment?
That's a great question. Madeline, you go first.
That's such a great question. So my friends call me a method writer, kind of like a method actor, where I feel like I do kind of put on the character and live inside the character. I feel like a lot of writers do this. I'm going to be really interested to hear, Victoria, what you say, because a lot of the times I don't know what's going to happen next. I mean, I have a basic idea. I know a little bit what I'm aiming for, but the moments sort of grow out of the character growing as they're being created. And so I don't have a lot of things that I know are going to happen because I want to leave room for her to grow. In my novel, Circe has this very significant relationship with Daedalus, the master craftsman of the ancient world, who creates the labyrinth that holds the Minotaur in mythology. And I did not expect that to happen at all. I knew he was going to appear very briefly, but their story ended up becoming much more significant to her and to the narrative as a whole. And so, I want to leave room for things like that. And it's just about trying to really live in this character's head and honor her impulses and her personality and her life, and not just bring sort of epic, not just give her an epic stage, but also make the things of her life. Circe happens to be a mother, so her motherhood is epic. And really be true to a three-dimensional psychology.
Oh my goodness. See, I love hearing how other authors work, because I have this, the thing is there's no right way, right? It's just whatever works for you. And I love it because I am so opposite. I'm a technician, and I think a lot of it has to do with like self-doubt. And the only way that I can get out of my own inner critic's way is to have a plan and then be like, see, we're okay. We can go down this road. With Addie, it was really interesting because I gave her 300 years, specifically, exactly 300. And then I broke the 300 years down into 100-year eras. And so her journey, both personally and in relationship to Luke, to the, not our devil, but our God, is really goes almost through 3 stages. And they're kind of like the 3 stages of grief for her own life, right? Like there's a lot of denial, and there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of hope, and there's ambition. And so I sculpted these emotional arcs, and then I knew I needed to lay them over a geography. And so I think it's really important to remember that what keeps Addie LaRue from becoming a travelogue is that when Addie makes her deal to live forever, it's not because she wants to see the world. She is not a grand adventurer. All she wants is time. All she wants is to get outside of the bounds of her village. And at that moment, when she makes that deal, the farthest she's ever gone is 40 miles from her home. And when she makes that deal, the next farthest place she goes is to Paris. So it's quite a bit farther, but it's still within. She doesn't leave France in the first 80 years of her deal, right? And it's very important that the world kind of unfolds in a very specific way around her, and that she is forced out of this comfort zone, but she's really constantly seeking comfort. She's constantly seeking, she follows art, and she follows culture, and she follows beauty, which is kind of a hedonistic bent to her. But I also had to look at like the boundaries. She can only stow away. So as technology increases, she has an even more limited ability to travel because she has no record of herself. And so I had to craft a path for her geographically that would kind of expand the boundaries of her own world very slowly. But I really started with the 3 kind of emotional arc beats of her 3 centuries that she moves through. I think the hardest part personally was the forgetting, because she's forgotten by everyone. And like the only time I'm not a method writer in the sense of being plunged into the narrative, but I'm very much a method writer in the sense of getting to the emotional heart of it. Mm-hmm. And writing Addie from that perspective was really hard. It was really hard. It was such a lonely place to be. And I have a very different personality from Addie. Addie's this relentless optimist, and I'm based on like Henry Strauss, the human boy in the book. And so it was really, even to the point where one of the first things that happens being that her own family forgets that she was ever there. And like, that was such a brutal place to be mentally. So I almost had to structure the book so that I could take these like gasping breaths and write the hopeful moments before plunging back into the difficult ones.
Wow. And Circe is also very lonesome and because she's in exile for a big chunk of the book. Is that in some ways reflecting sort of the writer's dilemma of having to sit in a room by yourself, like not with family or dogs or anything nearby?
Well, I think partially this sort of goes back to what Victoria was saying about sort of, you know, immortal women and what the experience is like for women who are immortal, and how much more protective you have to be of yourself and how much more careful. And so some of that exile is incredibly lonely for Circe. Some of it is very freeing, that it's protective for her and it's where she's allowed to really think and be herself. But I was struck by that when reading Addie LaRue is how lonely, and I think Circe also very lonely, and how often women, you know, who that isolation that would come with that felt so poignant, and it was difficult to write, but it also felt important to write. Sort of the double-sided edge of loneliness, the ability to create, to think, to be free in your mind, but to feel in some sense so restricted in your body.
Madeline, correct me if I'm wrong here, and it's been a tiny while since I devoured Circe, because I read it in like a single sitting, because I was like, "Nobody talk to me, goodbye," because I got to read it early, and I was just like, "Leave me alone." But I do feel like even though Circe loses track of time or puts away the concept of time, I feel like both Circe and Addie stay very present in terms of they don't become numb.
Yes,
there's like a sense of we hold them in an emotional presence. And that means that like neither one of them, you know, they're both immortal, neither one of them is immune from suffering. Neither one of them becomes numb in the way that so often, coming back to that idea of this masculine existential ennui that happens when you've just done it all, that I feel like is very kind of draped over a lot of male immortals. I feel like one of the challenges, but also one of the benefits, is that you don't ever let them slip into that almost existential pessimism.
Yes, and I think for me that was a really core part of the character, is that she is essentially a constructive person, and part of my vision of Circe is that she was an artist. That ancient witchcraft, you know, the way it's described in text, is it's not something that you are, it's something that you do. It comes out of knowledge and dedication and skill. It's knowing what plants to use when, and so Circe is able to stay connected to the world through her love of the natural world, animals and plants, and her art, which is her witchcraft. And I feel like it's interesting that there's an art connection with Addie.
Yeah. Well, it's true, though, because I think about it a lot in terms of when I was crafting Addie, I realized that spite would only carry her so far. Like, she has a lot of anger in her first 50 years, we'll say, towards Luke and what he's done to her. But I realized that at some point, anger is this very hot flame that dies quickly, and what happens when it burns out. And so for me, it was a transition between anger and hope. And something has to keep you going, whether it's art, whether it's love, whether it's a connectedness to the earth. Something is the choice to get up every day and carry on. And as you say, be a constructive person in that you're building, you're making something. And I feel like both Circe and Addie are finding ways to make something in their world.
Yeah. So this is going to go a little bit off topic, but and there's so many sort of striking and unexpected connections between your two books. But I think you've also been brought together, perhaps because you both had books that went viral on TikTok. and I wonder if you could tell me in any ways, are TikTok fans different from fans who've come to you through bookstore readings or other experiences in your life?
Oh, that's such a good question. Victoria, I feel like I'm going to put you on the spot first, because you are so much more social media savvy.
I mean, it kind of came out of the blue for me. Obviously, it's been an extraordinary phenomenon. It's really interesting. So I'm about to celebrate my 10-year publishing anniversary, and I've been very social media active for those whole decade. So I feel like I've watched the kind of nucleus of the voice in readership move from blogging to Twitter to Bookstagram to book talk, like to booktube and book talk. And it's so interesting because I think that I remember watching it move from blogging to booktube, like to the YouTube. And something I was struck by is there was a level of anonymity that could be achieved in blogging. And then when you came to booktube, it was a face on a camera standing by an opinion. And so what it created was an almost unintentional positivity movement, a focus on things they loved instead of things that they hated, because there was a sense of accountability and that they were putting their face to their opinion. And I feel like book talk is like a really interesting next generation version of that. Like it involves a personhood that goes with the opinion. I'm enamored with all of them. I think it's so cool. Like I just feel honored to watch readership be loud in this way. Like, I mean, how cool is that we're so often told throughout all of it, readers are going away, like books go away, books matter less. And then it's like, no, it just evolves and the readership evolves. And it's so cool to see people with like millions and millions of views talking about books. And I'm like, thank you for just like, I don't even like, I'm so honored that Addie is one of them, but I'm just really so glad that fandom exists at that volume for narrative form.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I feel the same way. I feel so thrilled when I mean, so honored also that Song of Achilles gets to be part of that and Circe gets to be part of that. But it's really been, it's just so exciting to see that level of passion. That people are so excited. And, you know, during the pandemic, I feel like it's especially been a lifesaver, you know, that people can still come together and talk with great passion about books and share their love for stories. I love the excitement that goes in. I love the cleverness, the wittiness, the theatricality. I mean, it's wonderful. It's just, it's so moving and so exciting.
I think that if we were sitting in front of a studio audience right now, which we're not, I know that book fans often want to know how you got started writing, or if you have a tip for people who are trying to get started in telling stories their own way. And I wonder if you might, do you have a tip? How did you get started?
How did you get started, Madeline?
So I love to write. From when I was a child, I wrote a lot. As soon as I really could write, starting in second grade, I have memories of writing stories. In fact, my second grade teacher pulled my mother aside at some point and she was like, well, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but only slightly. Like, your kid is pretty weird, but as long as she can write, she'll be okay. And I feel like, bless that teacher, she knew, you know, and so I continue to write stories. And I think hand in hand with my writing was my reading, that I read absolutely everything in the house, everything. I mean, I would literally go to the library and I'd just be like, okay, what's the next book on the shelf? That's the one. Okay, next book on the shelf. And so, but it never occurred to me that I could actually be a writer. I mean, I wanted to write, but the idea that I could actually be a writer would have been so exciting that I couldn't even let myself hope for it, except in very secret journal entries that I would like close up very quickly.
Yeah, I started quite young, but I started in poetry until I was about 18. And then I figured out, I mean, I am like, I'm trying to say, like, I want something besides Slytherin, is right. Like, grew up in like Harry Potter lexicon, and I'm trying to find my replacement lexicon these days. But I was grounded enough, ambitious enough that I remember thinking, I probably won't be able to make a career in poetry, but I wonder if there's a way that I can take what I love about poetry and of syllabolic rhythm and of cadence and of the atmosphere that can make and find a way to weave it into fiction to stand out in some way. And so, yeah, I wrote my first novel when I was 19 and it was absolutely terrible. And I feel like everyone should really make space for the first thing that they write to be just atrocious. The purpose of that is not to have a book at the end. The purpose is to learn a little bit more about how to write a story. And that can take 1 time or 25 times. It doesn't matter. But I think from the beginning on, I was just relentless. Like, I'm always my own worst enemy, but I am also know that I have to be my own champion. And when I would fail, I would try again and I would get better. And when I would get rejected, I would try again and I would get better. And I think that that's kind of goes hand in hand with the advice that I tend to give today, which is that like your desire for whatever it is you're trying to do, your desire has to outweigh your fear. And it's like fear never goes away. Fear is a part of it. Fear of failure, fear of inadequacy, fear of commentary and rejection, all of that. It just doesn't go away. I think we sit around waiting for fear to stop, and it doesn't. But as long as you want the thing more than you're afraid of it, even if it's just by that much, then you're going to keep going. And if your fear is always consistently louder than your desire, you're not going to.
I agree. That is so beautifully said. And I also had a novel I wrote at 19 that was absolutely horrendous and will never see the light of day, but was really significant for me. And I think the hardest thing is that when you write, you have to go in wholeheartedly. You have to believe that what you're writing is amazing, even if it turns out later than it's not, and the ability to have the resilience to realize that it's not, and then reinvest in it again with the same amount of hope. And so I feel like that's like a key ability of a writer.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I want, so that would have been such a great note to end on, but I want to ask you one more question. Victoria, you mentioned like capital H history, and both of your books covering hundreds of years managed to avoid dropping us into any wars, really. Victoria, there's like one little blip, but I remember when I was studying history as a topic, like in high school, it was just like war, which I didn't find all that interesting. But you're creating women's histories, although they're fictions, without war as part of the narrative. Was that a conscious decision to like avoid armed conflict in these big epic books?
I mean, for me, it was because I felt like there was a way to tell the story where it becomes Forrest Gumpian, right? Where it just becomes about, affecting the politics of the world. That's also not Addie's interest. And I feel like it's really important that we like make sure that when we're talking about history, also always acknowledging that it's written by victors. But like even that phrase, written by the victors, is about, conflict. And I wanted to look at but there's all these amazing other facets of time. There's technology and invention and art. And so it's one of the reasons that I made Addie a romantic in the truest sense of always being in the pursuit of the things which inspire. And I wanted to because I have an art historian background, I wanted to track it through art instead. And it's not better or worse, or it's not even like an intentional omission so much as I wanted to choose a path. And the path that I chose for Addie was one that looks at history through the lens of art.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a history professor, a classics professor, who on the first day of the Greek history course said, "This is a class about Greek history, so I don't want any questions about women or slaves." And I feel like that in some sense, my entire career is a response to that comment. That I feel like it's really important to not just have history be the story of men, the story of men who win, and to make sure that we are centering other stories. Now, war is an important part. It's an important thread in Circe, partially because Odysseus is a significant character. He both had tremendous glory from the war. He also has horrendous PTSD from the war. War really changed him. And he kind of re-enters his old life like a meteor leaving a crater when he re-enters it. And so, but though it's not really about the war, it's sort of about the like fractal effects of the war on all the people in Ithaca, on Odysseus's men, on Circe, on how war then goes out into the world and causes terrible destruction, but on the lives that are normally decentered around war. But sort of keeping war as part of the conversation. So I think that's so important to not just have history be about men who win.
Do you have any last words for the people who've tuned in? Because I have to shut us. Well, I have to shut us down. But do you have any last words? It's just been so delightful to hear you talk a little bit about your books, and I wish we had more time. Your books, which are right there.
I've got. Yes. And light it.
Okay.
There we go.
You can, there's a partner bookseller. It is bookshop.org/shop/SDFOB, which is San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. Thank you so much. And they are, again, Circe and the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. These are amazing books. Please pick them up at an indie bookseller near you or online. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.